Welcome everyone to this session on how power adapts to a changing world. I'm Karin von Hippel, the director of a think tank in London called RUSI, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here to this panel. Of course, it's a special pleasure to welcome the Minister of Defense from Germany, Ursula von der Leyen. She has been Minister of Defense in Germany since 2013 and is the first ever woman minister in German history. So it's a huge pleasure to have you here on our panel. We also have Mike Mazarr from RAND Corporation, and we have Hervé Lemahieu. My French is not so good. But we're going to have a really interesting conversation today because Hervé will start us out by showing us a really fascinating tool that he's developed to measure power, and he's measuring a full range of power, hard to soft power, or as some people call it, smart power. Secretary Clinton used to call it smart power. And so he's going to show us this tool for about 15 minutes, and then Mike will talk about the US view on are we in a more multipolar moment? How does the US perceive this, US government, and potentially the US population? Because I do think maybe there's some Americans are still thinking about this in a different way. And then, of course, the minister will talk, about Germany's role in Asia, and of course, Germany in Europe, and where Germany is going. So we will have a fascinating conversation and a wide-ranging conversation. And let me turn it over to Hervé to start us out.
Thank you very much. I might just move to the podium. So, thanks for that introduction. I think I'll kick off this session by making a few observations using an analytical tool which we at the Lowy Institute in Sydney have developed over the course of 2 years. That will allow us to think a bit through what might happen to the distribution of power globally, to the balance of power, as we move from an open and consensual world order to one that's defined more by competition and zero-sum politics, certainly between the two largest players, that's the United States and China. But I have to confess, my data set is limited to the Indo-Pacific, but that's not to say we can't extrapolate some global lessons which we can take forward in our discussion. And I'll make 3 points. One is that under most plausible scenarios, short of conflict, including what's sometimes called a new Cold War between the US and China, I don't think the US will be able to halt the narrowing power differential between itself and China. Second, I think globalization will still involve the United States and China, but perhaps not the two together. And that means a more hazardous variant of globalization dominated by spheres of economic influence. Thirdly, I think under such circumstances, middle powers in Asia, but also in Europe, become very crucial in the overall balance in terms of playing a third or intermediary role between these two powers that are gridlocked. In other words, I don't think, even if we are seeing a new Cold War between the US and China, that we will see fixed blocks defined in the sense of the last Cold War. But let me begin with a bit of history, because in 1995, the top 5 global economies were all, the United States followed by a series of its treaty allies. 4 of the 5 were transatlantic. And if we move forward from 1995, it's just really staggering to see how Asia's economic transformation has also shifted the distribution of power globally. So China went from an economy about the size of Spain in the mid-2000s, quickly surpassed Germany and France. By 2009, surpassed Japan. India, a bit more of a laggard, but has experienced its own economic miracle of sorts in its last decade, to the point that by 2023, the IMF expects India to be the 5th largest economy globally. And that's just at market exchange rates, because if you consider GDP using another measure, which is purchasing power parity, we actually see that China is already larger than the United States by 33%. So there we go. In geostrategic terms, it's the relativities that matter. And China's economic rise, by definition, imposes geostrategic costs for the US as the incumbent world power. Nevertheless, I think I should stress that it's not absolute decline that the United States is in, it's simply relative, and that's an important distinction to make. Now, it's not just economic resources that matter for power. In our conceptualization of power, we think that there are at least 8 thematic distinctions to be made. There's military capability. There's also resilience, which is the capacity to deter real or potential threats to state stability. There are future trends insofar as the future distribution or projected distribution of military and demographic economic resources affects the perceptions of power today. And it's not just what you have, it's also what you do with what you have in terms of your diplomatic networks, in terms of your economic relationships, in terms of your defense diplomacy, which acts as a force multiplier of military capability, and in terms of your cultural influence. So there are many variables involved here. In fact, we've got about 120 indicators in total, and when we aggregate that, we come to a picture, an outline of the distribution of power in Asia. And what's immediately apparent is that China and the United States are peer competitors here, but that the US maintains a sort of 10-point lead, some degree of primacy over China, because while China has established itself firmly as the engine of factory Asia, it remains hobbled in key respects. It has a lot of distrustful neighbors. It's not exerted the same degree of political leadership. It certainly doesn't have the defense clout that the US has. And the US also brings soft power to the equation. So as the biggest cultural influencer in terms of exports of goods and services into the region, but also the way that information flows are structured. So, I also want to mention that it's not just a two-player game. If you actually look at how countries perform in terms of their resource scores, so that's their military and economic performance, and in terms of their broad-based influence in diplomacy and in economic influence, you see that a lot of the second-tier players, the multilateral players, actually overachieve relative to their size. So a city-state like Singapore, 5.6 million people, can be an overachiever in a rules-based order that is largely consensual, because multilateral players work in coordination to pursue their interests. Misfit middle powers like Russia and even North Korea, while powerful in their own right in terms of the overall ranking, their power is premised more on their resources, less on broad-based influence within a multilateral order. So that's what power looks like within a sort of rules-based order that is under stress, but I think still ticking along in Asia. Now, obviously, it's coming under strain, particularly because of what's happened in terms of US political leadership. President Donald Trump has made it clear that multilateralism is not his priority, and when we asked a sample group of policymakers and experts in the region, they actually ranked the US 13th in terms of political leadership, the quality of diplomatic leadership in Asia for 2017. Others have filled the void, so there's China there, but there's also Singapore and Japan, so these middle powers are working much harder to maintain their comparative advantage. And one example, for example, is the TPP, the fact that the US, after it abandoned the TPP, Singapore and Japan were able to resuscitate that partnership minus the United States. But I think it does seem clear that we're moving into a world defined by mercantilism and geopolitics, by a zero-sum logic as opposed to positive sum. And in that world, technology starts mattering more in a geopolitical sense, technological arms race, but also international leverage, so geopolitical tools like the power of the US dollar, the financial sanctions the US can invoke, but also trade and investment policy are being used in a much more geopolitical sense. Now, it remains to be seen whether these are tidings which will be reversible, or whether we're really moving into an era-defining moment where the US proclaims its mission in Asia to be one of competition with China. Let's assume that we are moving into what some people have called a new Cold War. That would require us to recalibrate some of our assumptions, our weighting strategy for the index. So that's what we've done here. This is what power looks like today. and this is what we think power would look like under a Cold War. And that's because in a situation where rules-based globalism moves away in favor of raw heft, we actually think that the US loses its comparative advantage as a multilateral player and that China gains. Similarly, smaller economies that are dependent on export-driven models suffer, so that's countries like Singapore, like Malaysia, whereas more insulated economies that are relying on domestic consumption do better. So Indonesia moves up 2 rankings, so does India. That's premised on 3 assumptions, this new Cold War. One is that there would be a paralysis in economic governance, that there is no lowest common denominator other than the agreements to disagree. And I think we've seen signs of that at the G7 and at the latest APEC summit in Papua New Guinea, where leaders were unable even to come up with a leader communique, a diplomatic communique at the end. But it could get a lot worse. So for example, at the end of the year, the rules-based trading system built around the World Trade Organization could wither, if not crack under pressure. And that's because by December, there'll only be 1 judge left on the World Trade Organization's appellate body, which means appeals and trade law enforcement will go into limbo. That will affect a lot of trade-dependent countries, particularly smaller ones. The second assumption I'm making is that the US is serious. Sorry, I'm just going to move onwards here. This is the back end of our weightings calculator. But the second assumption I'm making here is that the US is serious about pursuing what's been called economic decoupling between the world's 2 largest economies. That is a kind of reversal of globalization in such a way that the US disentangles American companies and their technologies from China's supply chains. Now, it's not clear that that's possible, but even allowing for that possibility, our model shows that decoupling would have a limited impact on China's overall growth trajectory. The US could slow but not reverse China's ascendancy. So what you see here is that we've assumed that there's a departure from current trends in 2018, that through the use of export controls, generalized tariffs, and other punitive measures, the US gets very serious about open-ended disentanglement with China. That would produce a hit equivalent to about 3.5% of China's GDP, which is roughly the domestic value it gains from the export that it does with the US. It would also hit the United States, and you could say, in sort of in a Trumpian sense, beggar thy neighbor, that China loses out slightly more. Its economy would be about 8% smaller than forecast in 2030. The US economy would be about 3% smaller than forecast in 2030. But my point is that the overall growth trajectory, the rise of China, thinking that you could somehow contain the rise of China, isn't necessarily going to work. The reason that's the case is that China is much less vulnerable to escalating trade tensions than many believe. China has become the world's largest trading nation, but counterintuitively, its GDP becomes less dependent on exports. So it's at the moment, China's trade to GDP ratio is about 37%. If you compare that to Vietnam, for example, Vietnam's trade as a percent of its GDP is over 200%. So this suggests to me that China is less susceptible to the downsides of a bilateral trade war with the United States, but that the region at large, which by and large is strategically friendly to the US, may be much more so. So there's a number of other variables we look at here, but let me move on. And the point I'm also making is that there's obviously a concern in the technological arms race that China may at some point start to surpass the United States in terms of AI, in terms of biotech, in terms of information technology. That may or may not happen, but it will not happen because Western markets close themselves off to Chinese tech. If you look at the remarkable success of Huawei, its growth has come from domestic sources, from China, where it's grown 200% in the last 5 years, but also emerging markets. So the point here is that I think that Western markets will actually be negligible to the ascendancy of China's tech industry. The third assumption I'm making for a Cold War is that middle powers will assert some form of strategic autonomy between the US and China. In other words, there will not be fixed blocks in this economic Cold War. The US will be hard-pressed finding regional friends willing to join it in decoupling from China, and the reason is quite simple. China does about 70% more trade with the region than does the US. And for major industrialized allies of the US, like Japan, like South Korea, even Australia, decoupling plus America first is basically a bit of a toxic recipe. We want to see our economic ties with China managed but not necessarily severed. Now, the US has a range of carrots and sticks it can deploy in this so-called Cold War. On the one hand, it could promise to relocate supply chains outside of China and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. That's the carrot side. On the stick side, we've seen the inclusion of so-called poison pills, poison pill clauses within the US's renegotiated trade agreement, particularly with US, Mexico, and Canada, which seek to reduce China's integration with America's own economic partners. But again, the fundamental point I'm making here is that the focus on securing bilateral trade deals and balancing trade flows one country at a time is unlikely to stem China's influence. It's just simply too big. Far from containing China, this kind of economic decoupling approach or forcing choices from third countries may ensure that global supply chains actually remained anchored in China after all. This is another chart that shows the final destination for East Asian exports. Whereas in 2000, the West still accounted for about 50% of all East Asian exports in value-added trade. Today, East Asia and non-Western economies accounts for about 2/3 of that balance. So that's another way of making that point. Now, how does this affect the military balance of power? Because all these things are interrelated. And here's a bit of a global history since 2005 of defense spending trends. And what we see is that China climbs the ranks, but perhaps not as drastically as it's been able to catch up to the United States in terms of its GDP. Still, though, by 2023, we'd expect that 4 out of 5 top military spenders will be in Asia. Again, this is ground zero for great power relations globally. Now, you cannot preclude the possibility that an economic Cold War risks turning into a hot war. And when you look at history, there are plenty of examples of confrontations in economic terms that have escalated into conflicts. However, for the moment, it seems one of the hallmarks of our consensual rules-based order is that defense spending as a percent of GDP remains rather stable. And so stable, in fact, that I think the US still has a decisive military advantage in terms of the military balance of power in Asia. It's not just the fact that US defense spending is that much bigger, but it's the unrivaled alliance network that the US brings. So you can see here the hub and spoke network of Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And at the same time, other regional players are essentially hedging their bets against the rise of China by pursuing more non-allied partnerships, more joint training exercises, as a way essentially of mitigating against the rise of China as a military force. So again, China is in some ways, this is China's Achilles heel in terms of its balance of power in Asia. So our assessment of what a maritime conflict in East Asia would do to the balance of power is the following. The US still maintains a huge advantage. This is assuming that the conflict takes place in the near future. Countries like Japan go down because they've got smaller militaries, and ironically, New Zealand crops up in top 10, and that's to do with the fact that it has geography on its side. The further removed you are from conflict, the more friends and fish surround you, the more, in some ways, that you could endure a conflict. The more in the middle of the action that you are, the more that your energy security and all the rest becomes compromised. So under current trends, I would think that the US maintains its military dominance in Asia. So this is what defense expenditure in 2030 would look like. But this assumes that China's defense spending as a percent of GDP remains constant. Now, what happens under a sort of long-term escalation of conflict in such a way that it resembles a bit more of a Cold War? I would assume that China could, in fact, ramp up its defense spending as a percent of GDP from 1.9% currently to rival the US at about 4.3%. And in that case, I would think that China has much more fiscal headspace to actually catch up with the United States. So this will be a long-term battle of political will and defense economics. And let's keep in mind that the US has commitments that are spread across the globe that it is increasingly skeptical of, whereas China can concentrate its resources on Asia. So that concludes my session, my presentation. In other words, the three key points are: I don't think the United States can or even really should attempt to prevent China's emergence as a potential peer. There's no reason to assume China will automatically replace the United States as an undisputed unipolar power, at least not in Asia. And there are aggravating consequences economically and militarily of pursuing a so-called new Cold War strategy unilaterally through zero-sum politics. I would think the US would need to find a way to live with China, playing its strengths as a multilateral player. China will continue to chip away at America's margin of preeminence, but let's also keep in mind that the rise of India will mean that India will start chipping away at China's predominance, particularly as China starts to age. So I'll leave the rest to our discussion now.
Thank you very much, Hervé. Really interesting. If you wanted to clap, yeah. It's a really it's an amazing tool. We don't want to spend time quibbling with the numbers or the projections. I just think it's an important way to look at different scenarios and think about the shifting balance of power. And in fact, the conclusions at the end were very similar to the previous panel, which I was just sitting in at the very end. We have to live with China and other countries, and how do we adapt this multipolar world? So, Mike, tell us a bit how this, first maybe some reflections from your end on this presentation, and then how does America First fit into this whole?
Yeah, uncomfortably at best. Thank you. It's an honor to be on the panel today. And I would say that at RAND, we're gathering data on exactly these kind of issues right now and the current trends. We've relied on the Lowy Institute. This is fantastic work. You should definitely check out their site online afterward, because there's a lot more really interesting stuff there. I'll make two broad points about what I think the objective realities are about U.S. power, and then a couple of implications quickly in just a couple of minutes. So first of all, I think, looking at the data, and I think more or less as you've laid out, I think it's undeniable that the United States will remain the first among equals. So we're not talking about a power transition in the sense that broadly as a comprehensive power, the United States is overtaken by China or anybody else. Obviously, the U.S. share of world GDP is going down somewhat, but it's still one of the top three. And in terms of the projections, you're looking at a world where three giant economic powers kind of sit on top of a bunch of very significant but somewhat smaller powers. And the United States is certainly one of those. If you look at certain U.S. advantages, like the dollar as the reserve currency, the U.S. role as the hub of internet networks, a variety of structural and systemic advantages, and then, of course, U.S. military power, you add that all together, and I think you have a United States that is still the top comprehensive world power out to 2050, 2060, and potentially indefinitely. However, the second big reality is obviously that the relative predominance is unquestionably being eroded over time. This is obviously true in terms of share of global GDP. It is true in terms of share of a lot of other things. I just noticed a figure the other day that back in the 1950s, the United States had something like 70% of world R&D spending took place just in the United States, and now it's something like a third of that. Mm-hmm. There's a host of measures like that that show that China, India, developing countries are relatively overtaking the United States. And then in the military realm, as you mentioned, the United States is a country with global responsibilities. The problem is the U.S. does not measure military predominance based on overall defense spending, as you know very well, but in terms of the U.S. military's ability to perform certain very specifically defined contingency missions. And in that regard, the relative U.S. degree of predominance is clearly eroding and will continue to do so. It's why you see multiple U.S. Defense leaders talk about the gap between the defense budget and the defense strategy. That is not going away, it's only intensifying. So, the United States, I think, will have to adjust to a world in which it is the first among equals or more equal countries rather than the predominant power, and efforts to recapture primacy aren't really the way to go. A couple of very quick lessons from that. First of all, this is an unprecedented demand on the United States in its entire history as a nation. We have been a relatively isolationist power at a time when there was a more multipolar world balance, and we have been a significant world leader at a time when there was a bipolar balance where we're the leader of the non-communist world, and when there was a unipolar balance. We have never in our history had to be a significant global leader in a truly multipolar environment. And that is something that will come about as this future unfolds. Secondly, there are certain aspects of the U.S. strategic personality that make us, I fear, not very good at that task. We are not very good at dealing with countries that are neither friends nor enemies. We typically justify very significant foreign policy investments by finding somebody to demonize. We're not very good at sharing power. We do not have concepts that fit into this gap. Right now in the debate in Washington, there's a group defending sort of predominance and primacy, and then you go to the other end of the foreign policy conceptual spectrum, and you have advocates of significant restraint or retrenchment, but there are not very well-defined concepts in between that allow us to approach specifically how we would tackle this challenge. Third, we have to do this while undergoing a significant domestic revitalization. This has been a theme of the day. We've got enormous social problems to tackle, significant economic problems. I'll give you only one example. According to the latest CBO projection, within 6 years, interest payments on the debt in the United States will equal the U.S. defense budget. By the year 2039, if current laws don't change, interest payments on the debt will equal all of federal revenues. We will not have a dollar to spend on anything else. Now, of course, current laws won't stay the same. But it gives you a sense of the scale of fiscal transition we have to make. How do we uphold the defense spending? How do we move into new areas of diplomatic and economic competition with that? Fourth and finally, a clear lesson to me is that multilateralism is the dominant successful strategy in this kind of a world. And in fact, one lesson is that a legacy of the post-war order we've built is this coalition of value-sharing democracies and status quo powers that may not all be democracies, is still the predominant set of powers. If you put together the United States, our European allies, our Asian allies, India, a handful of other countries, you have the predominant share of world GDP and world military spending. But can the United States continue to act multilaterally? Obviously, right now that's somewhat threatened, and as a function of the domestic transition we're going through. So, in theory, a thoughtful America ought to be able to manage this transition and continue to lead a multilateral balance of power that still favors stable order. In practice, the real America we get, and in fact, real other powers we get, may not be able to manage the transition as they theoretically should be able to.
And then what then, right? So
Right.
we'll get to that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. Very stimulating. So, Minister, tell us a bit how you feel about this. Obviously, Europe as a power isn't on this, and it would be great, Hervé, your next assignment is to add Europe in there, because I think it'd be very interesting to see Europe as a bloc compared to China and the US. But just thoughts on Germany in Europe, in Asia, or Germany in Asia, or your reflections?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, compliments and respect what your research work is concerned. And indeed, I would be thrilled to see what it shows when you include data from Europe. Therefore, I was busy taking notes, and I can only reflect on what you said here. Mike, thank you also for what you said. Interestingly, listening to you, I had immediately the thought, we have a completely different European historical experience. We come as a continent from the disaster of 2 world wars. So we have learned a bitter lesson that if we fight with each other, we're all losing. And out of that grew the European idea that if we work together, we come into a win-win situation. You were talking about the zero-sum game. Our European experience is just the opposite. That zero-sum game, where you have a winner and there has to be a loser, is disastrous. And therefore, we are very much trained on the win-win situation idea. We've made, of course, practical experiences when you look at, for example, the eastern countries in Europe after the wall came down. There was, of course, at the beginning a slight fear in the old European countries that what happens with our economies. Finally, the moment they joined the European Union, we saw prosperity was going up on both sides. So the classical experience of a win-win situation is deeply rooted in our historical experience. Second point, we were always used, and this could only happen under the security umbrella of the United States, plus Marshall Plan, if I may put it that way. So Europe is also trained that we were becoming a more and more economic power, knowing that in the critical conflict situation, there are the United States fixing it, if I may put it that way. Actually, with reunification, it was George Bush Sr. who offered to Germany partnership and leadership. Germany shied away, didn't want to do that. Big mistake. Now, in these times where we have an American president who says NATO is obsolete, or I don't care about Europe, we have to learn the lesson that we have to be able to deal with the problems in our neighborhood that affect us immediately, and we have to be able to deal with them on the whole scale. Therefore, not only the economic power will play a role for Europe, but also Europe's ability to stabilize in its neighborhood, going from Russia through near Middle East, through Africa, all around Europe, not around America, to stabilize there in a combination of diplomacy, of economic development, and if necessary, military stabilization. This is something we're stepping up. We call it, we want to stay transatlantic, but become more European. It's a difficult process, but this is the way the deep-rooted experience in us keeps us acting. You said we have to live with China. And that's true. China is challenging in a way no other country ever did it to Europe. And it has, of course, positive impacts, but it has, of course, difficult impacts too. I'm only talking about the power projection we see in the South China Sea, for example. Talking about Belt and Road, the moment it turns into economic dependency of weaker countries, we know that it has a huge negative impact. And of course, the whole cyber topic is a very demanding one. If we look at the cyber attacks in Europe, on the military side, the number one address is Russia. On the economic side, the number one address is China. So many difficult points to deal with. Ironically, because, and you were talking about allies and friends, because in the last years, the situation for us with our allies, the Western democracies, is getting more and more vulnerable, if I may put it that way, because of disturbing disturbing sentences we hear from the White House. We find ourselves now and then, all of a sudden, on the side together with China against the United States. Climate treaty was, for example, something. All of a sudden, we found ourselves in a position where we would never have thought to be there. The same goes with the JCPOA treaty with Iran. So indeed, at the moment being, we see a world where it's completely unpredictable for us how the power play is going to move forward. And the one thing we know, it's a multipolar world. We, the Europeans, are deeply convinced that we do have a multilateral order that is to be defended because it's the one we built up after World War II, and it's the best we have, even if it's sometimes slow, even if it has to be reformed, even if we're sometimes frustrated with the outcome, but it's the one and only we have and the best one we have. So that's one point where Europe is working hard in it. Very last point, I guess you have included deeply demography in your research.
Yes.
Because if you look at that too, the picture changes again. But this is perhaps another topic for another session.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. But Minister, can I ask you a question before I go the other way about, you touched on the strategic autonomy in Europe issue when you said stay transatlantic but become more European, or is that not really how you interpret strategic autonomy? In other words, is that Europe going it alone, fully without the US, keeping the US informed, but understanding the US may not be there?
Well, the first place for anything that is Article 5 collective defense is NATO. So absolutely clear. Europe will never ever be a purely military alliance. But as I said, there are many places where I do not see NATO, for example in Africa, like in Mali. But I do see the necessity that Europe is able to act. In the last years, we were willing sometimes, politically willing to act, but we didn't have neither the structures nor the procedures to act when it's necessary. Mali was a typical example. Europe wanted to help, but couldn't, so France had to go first, and then we slowly but surely, is after months, the rest of Europe followed up. Therefore, out of that reason, we are building up the European Defence Union that is assembling these 27 armed forces plus times 27 economic development plus diplomacy that should be with one voice, so that we have a European approach, for example, to deal with our neighbor Africa and African states, knowing that this is not a typical NATO procedure.
Okay, thank you. Hervé, did you want to reflect on their comments at all?
I thought Mike's comment about first among equals is absolutely correct. I think sometimes we overplay this idea that China will become a unipolar power, and I don't think it will. One of the very evident things that we see is that it's, in terms of its political leadership, it's hobbled in Asia, but elsewhere. There's increasing skepticism as well. But then, as the minister pointed out, the demographics aren't favorable either. China loses about 40 million people from its working age population between now and 2030 alone. And that will actually only accelerate towards the mid-century. America, on the other hand, demographically favorable picture, geographically favorable, still innovative. And so I think we sort of confound the relative loss of the US standing with a sort of an absolute decline. If that happens, it'll be for political reasons, but not for the kind of base ingredients of what constitutes power. So I'd leave my comments at that. On Europe, it's an incredibly interesting subject to include within research of this scale, because do you treat it like its own actor, or do you treat it as 27 member states? And in some sense, it functions as one actor on trade, so that would make it incredibly, actually, economically influential, even in Asia, and perhaps more so than the US, in terms of sanctions policy and all the rest. But then when it comes to matters of security, strategy, we haven't yet seen the kind of development, or at least there's a gap between the vision and reality. So that still needs to be bridged. But I would love to include it at some point.
Right, and of course, many European countries, including the United Kingdom, are incredibly distracted right now by the politics of populism. And so it's hard to imagine them speaking with one voice on some of these serious issues. Mike, we haven't talked much about Russia. Russia has featured a bit in Hervé's model. Obviously Russia and Asia, but Russia is still, while not an economically strong power, has managed to punch above its weight globally, right? We've seen it in the Balkans, the Baltics, we've seen it in the United States, their use of cyber, as you mentioned, Minister, trying to really disrupt in many ways. I mean, how do you, and of course, President Trump not being willing to call Russia out, even if many on his team are pushing quite hard, and below, let's just say, across the diplomatic and security sphere, they're obviously pushing quite hard on Russia. What are your thoughts?
Well, so two things. One is, and this is strictly my opinion, I as much as a good deal of Russia's behavior over the last few years has been unacceptable, I see the dialogue in Washington spinning very quickly in the direction of really extreme demonization of both Russia and China in ways that I think are already not only kind of in a mindset term, but also legislatively creating things that are going to make it very difficult to pivot into any other different direction. From the standpoint of global power balances and global competition, for the United States, it's a multilateral game within which the U.S.-China relationship is the dominant one. And to me, the challenge with Russia is dealing with their efforts to get noticed by disrupting the system in a way that can somehow stabilize this relationship with the West and reduce the incidence of a lot of this Russian behavior. And that is, I don't know if that's a precondition for getting the China issue right, but the difficulty is that the politics on both sides are making it extremely difficult to achieve that. And more than that, I don't know that in the United States we have a concept right now of how we get from where we are to where we want to be with Russia. I think where we want to be is never going to be a warm and close relationship, at least not under the current leadership. But I think it can be. There's no reason why it can't be a more stable relationship. However, things like Ukraine, things like the intervention in democracies, and a whole range of other behavior on Russia's part, very rightly, the West has responded vigorously to that. And in the United States, what I notice most is a lack of ideas for how we can somehow transcend that, short of simply punishing Russia until it changes its behavior, which I'm not sure is going to work.
Okay, thank you. Minister, Chancellor Merkel obviously has a complicated but close relationship with Putin in many ways. Does Germany have a better idea about how to channel Russia into being a more positive global player?
It's true, President Putin and Chancellor Merkel know each other since 15 years, I think. They're talking on a weekly basis. I'd say she has the advantage to speak Russian, and he has the advantage to speak German. So they do not need any translators, and of course, they know each other very well. And therefore, first thing, Russia does not respect weakness. So don't be fooled by being nice. On the other hand, Russia is our neighbor. It will be our neighbor, stay there, and we have to deal with it. This is, in a nutshell, the point. So you have to build up your own strength. You have to show stamina what your own values are concerned. Otherwise, Russia will never, ever respect you. For us, the change from 2013 on, the annexation of Crimea, the hybrid war in Ukraine, and then the follow-on story was at the beginning a real shock, because before that we had the illusion that we could build together a European large house. We had to adapt to reality. I think looking at Russia on the long term, economy will play a vast role. Russia's GDP is smaller than Italy's. It has a severely aging society. The economy is heavily energy dependent. So the productivity related to the aging society is not there as it should be. It's not modernized. Crimea is expensive. Eastern Ukraine is expensive. Syria is expensive if you look at the cost side. Therefore, it has to be in our interest to convince Russia over time that it's in their interest to play more by the rules, and to get back to a path that will, from which one they will benefit too. I want to be clear on to play by the rules is the rules-based order, nothing else. So respect the sovereignty of other countries, for example. Sometimes the Kremlin is saying we have to establish a new rules-based order. No, we do have one. It's a good one. So we have all to play by the rules, and this is a concept where it takes time. You have to be patient. You have to build up your own strength. Otherwise, you will not be sustainable enough in that game. But this amount of respect you have to show to the other player is very crucial. I think I must say one of the deepest humiliations of Russia was you are a regional power. They've never ever forgot that. This does not excuse any invasion in eastern Ukraine and any annexation of Crimea, but just to understand a bit where things did come from.
Yes, although other countries have gotten over that, right? The UK or the Portuguese Empire, they can't get over that. But yes, I understand.
Well, it might be right, but to say it
I know, I understand.
is the painful part.
Right. Well, let's open the floor to questions. Take about 3 or 4. Yeah, please introduce yourself if you don't mind as well. Oh, hang on. Sorry, there's a microphone coming.
I'm Alexander Betts. I'm the distraction Brit who can't get over a fire. I want to pick up Mike's comment about the inadequacy of the concepts that we have available today. What's very clear is that in the analysis, which was excellent, you're working with a set of concepts, polarity, balance of power, grand strategy, that have a neo-realist heritage, that are dominant ideas in the US mainstream of how we look at defense, security, and international relations. It's also very clear when we come to the minister's comments that the German and indeed European perspective works with different underlying concepts. There were mentions of absolute gains, mentions of values, things that have a heritage that's more liberal institutionalism, constructivist ideas within international relations. It's also clear that China works with a different conceptual framework. Its ideas of what constitutes strategy, what constitutes power, are different. And so my question is twofold. Firstly, where can our concepts go? And how might conceptual shift change both the policy and the behavior? And secondly, how do we take into account the difference in our concepts versus China's concepts in the way we think about this?
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, please. Speaker from the previous panel.
Hi, Adam Tooze, Columbia University. I don't want to relitigate the Ukraine crisis, but one of the things that was missing from the stories told about it so far is the preceding struggle between Russia and the EU over various types of change, not in the rules, but in the structures which operate within those rules. In other words, Eastern Partnership, association agreements, which were perceived by one side as aggressive, and then the counter-offer of Eurasian Union on the Russian side, and then those were made into exclusive alternatives. And it's out of that imbroglio, combined with a bit of bad financial diplomacy and the EU's usual stinginess, that we end up in the catastrophe of the fall of 2013 and the denouement in 2014, which involves Russia's aggression and the annexation of Crimea. What's interesting about that, I think, is not only what it tells us about Russia's red lines, which are that it doesn't want to see the extension of Western organizations, and President Putin made this abundantly clear at Munich in 2007. And either we respect that or we don't, and if we don't respect it, there will be consequences. But more interestingly, I think, for the geometry in East Asia, it points to the way in which America's alliance system, which is so often presented as a source of strength, can also be an enormous generator of stress, in that moves independently by regional actors, in this case the Europeans, who are extending the brief of the EU into a zone of hard conflict whilst Brussels maintains it doesn't do geopolitics, precipitate a crisis with a hard actor, Russia, which America then ends up intervening in, and we're back in the situation of 2014. And that seems to me to be one of the potentially alarming scenarios that you were sketching for us in East Asia. And we saw some inklings of it, I think, with Abe's administration in Japan in 2014 and struggles there. And the questions in the US were, how do we act? Like, do we encourage the Japanese to strengthen their position, or do we encourage them to weaken their position? That, I think, is for me a big question going forward in these shatter zones that you've mapped so brilliantly for us.
Yeah, it's a good question. Building on Alexandra's question as well, is very different viewpoint from Obama versus Trump as well on that, yeah. Okay, yeah, please over there in the corner, and then we'll turn back to the panel.
Thank you. This is indeed thought-provoking. I'm Debbie Stoddard from FADH, the International Federation for Human Rights. And we actually try to demystify human security with grassroots activists. And looking at this picture, one of the things that comes to me is the fact that to ask the question whether the brittleness of governments is actually factored in, because China is a highly centralized government, and it is unable to cope very often with unexpected natural disasters, the consequences of climate change, etc., because everything has to be run through Beijing. There's also a great deal of public distrust in China, in Asia, even though our states are hungry for Chinese investment. So I think there's looking at structures of governance and also looking at, well, we often talk about GDP adjusted for PPP. We also need to understand and think very deeply about growing inequality and how that also contributes to internal instability, and the fact that we need to factor in the impacts of both irregular and regular migration. And when we talk about the hot war, did you factor in proxy conflicts? Because we are starting to see the emergence of that. In our region. So, and I'm concerned about all of this because I'm always concerned about the human rights impacts.
Right.
So this has been fascinating, but these are the questions that I have.
Yeah, no, it's lots of. Okay, so everyone, we start with you.
Should I?
Yes,
Yep.
please.
Okay. So lots of questions there, very fascinating. Firstly, well, let me address them in reverse order. So I'll start with you. This notion that power also relies on internal variables. You know, it's not just an external game. Weak governments are susceptible also to foreign influence, including proxy conflict. You only need to look at, for example, Syria, basically a dysfunctional state, to realize that you become a theater of great power contestation without an ability to govern your country. So yes, we do actually look at resilience. Under resilience, we look at internal threats to state stability, and we looked at the incidence rate of internal conflict. And also the instances in the last 40 years in which that internal conflict had been internationalized in some form. The brittleness of governance is a very interesting and obviously a very heated debate as to which form of government is inherently better or more durable as a means of projecting power. Whether that's democracy, which we in the West would like to think, or whether that's centralized authority in sort of more autocratic sense. There are pros and cons because autocrats can really mobilize resources centrally like very few democracies can. So they can often be more responsive to contingencies. But one of the things that we try not to enter too much into that sort of polemical debate because it gets a bit theoretical and subjective, but one of the things we do note in our data is that the larger a country you are, the more labored you are with governance costs. And that makes sense. It's easier to manage a city-state of 5.6 million people than it is to manage 1.3 billion. Add inequality to that, add internal conflict to that, and it becomes even more difficult. So again, when we look at China's GDP, we also have to consider the fact that a lot of its defense spending is actually allocated towards internal security threats. And so that is something that we try, in some sense, to discount from China, looking at its resilience. Secondly, let's go to alliances. I thought that was a really interesting question. Alliances not simply as kind of force multipliers of power, but actually as something that might drain power in some sense because of how politically compromising or time-consuming and energy-consuming they can be. that's a very, I mean, it's a very relevant argument in light of Trump because it's exactly what he's arguing. I think in the East Asian scenario, it's very clear that if you didn't have Japan and South Korea under a US alliance umbrella, things would be even worse or more difficult to manage. Because Japan and South Korea have long-standing historical antagonisms. The alliance in some way pacifies that. Japan may well decide to go nuclear if it can't rely on a sort of extended nuclear umbrella from the United States, or even if it has reason to doubt that the US would come to its rescue faced with the conflicts it has in the East China Sea with China, you might see a resurgent Japan. And so there's this kind of zero-sum politics then takes shape. So yes, alliances are resource draining, but the alternative, I would argue, is worse. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, as to the values, different ways of looking at the world, of approaching the world, of even understanding power, right? Because a European may not understand power in the same way as a Chinese might or as an American would. And again, we're trying to demystify these theories by just looking at what's happening in terms of data as much as possible. If we're moving towards a Sinocentric order, we should be able to see that. BRI should have this kind of galvanizing effect where countries become economic tributary states. So far, we're not seeing that. If we're moving towards institutionalism and non-zero sum or positive sum politics, then we should expect the second-tier multilateral players to be doing much better in terms of our power gap, which they were for the 2 decades, but I think is increasingly coming under stress. So we're letting the data speak for itself, try not to dress it up too much in grand theory, and then see what happens.
Great, thank you. Mike, any?
I'll just say one quick thing that draws together the point about the concepts and the point about Ukraine. I think if the major strategic challenge for the United States is trying to behave in a way it's never had to behave before, the major challenge for the order is preserving a liberal order in a less liberal world and dealing with the dilemmas that arise from that. And I think that Ukraine is a great example of how commitment to certain kinds of values of independence and the freedom to associate ends up creating a clash with one of the great powers. We're going to have similar choices with China, which gets back to the question of whether China's concepts can be integrated. And it's going to be, I think, an incredibly difficult balancing act to walk that tightrope to not, because I'm actually optimistic that the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia have a powerful set of shared values and norms that which will be more than sufficient, even if we debate around the edges, to get us through this transition. The question is, since 1989, we got into a little phase of liberal overreach, of thinking that we had no rivals anymore and we could extend those everywhere we wanted. We have to back off from that a bit without sacrificing our values. What does that balancing act look like? On top of the balancing act of the U.S. adjusting, on top of the U.S. domestic transition to a new kind of approach to late capitalism, it's an unprecedented challenge for the world's leading strategic actor.
Okay, great, thank you. Any concluding thoughts, Minister,
Yes,
or answers to the questions?
2 more concluding thoughts. First of all, if you look at China, Chinese attitude is, if I put it in a little bit easy way, the last 2,000 years were yours, the next 2,000 years are ours. I'm speaking about the long lines, and dealing with China is developing a strategy of long lines and not a disruptive Twitter behavior, because this will not fit the Chinese attitude. Looking at that picture, there are many smaller countries, and I'm always thinking out of the European experience. All of us, 28 or 27 in Europe, we know each of us is not able to tackle with any of the problems around us. Germany knows that, for example, as the largest economy in Europe. But together, as 27, we are a power that is not neglectable. So, and we've often been talking over the last years with those so-called smaller countries around in Asia, the ASEAN, for example. Why don't you get your act together, not only in an economic cooperation, but also move on politically? Of course, you will never have the Chinese strength, but if you gather you might have an influence that is way beyond what each single little country or state is able to produce. So the smaller countries like us should start to think about what are alliances. If I look at Europe, for example, as an alliance or as a union of 28 at the moment, perhaps 27, if I look at Europe, the countries are standing in line who want to have free trade agreements with Europe. So such a union is attractive. And it wouldn't be the case if these were 27 isolated countries. But Europe as a whole is enormously attractive, for example, for free trade agreements or other kind of agreements you could think of. So draw strength out of an alliance might be the lessons for the smaller Asian countries to cope with China.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Given we're in Switzerland, we need to end with Swiss efficiency. It's exactly 1 o'clock. And I just want to thank, is it 1? Yeah, it is 1 o'clock. I just want to thank Hervé for a really incredible tool that tries to capture complexity and soft and hard data, basically. It's a really huge challenge, and we're all very grateful, and we're looking forward to the next iterations of this when it gets even more complex. Mike, thank you so much for your thoughtful comments, and of course, Minister, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure chairing this panel. So can all of you please just join me in thanking our speakers?
Thank you.
Thank you.